Hello everyone, it's Mary Collier here. I'm the Professional Development Program Manager at the Ontario Museum Association, and I am very happy to welcome you to our second webinar in our summer series, Conservation 2.0, a Good Practice Refresher. So can I just make sure that everybody can hear me? Can I get a little yay or nay in the chat? Excellent. Thanks everybody. All right, so we are very pleased to partner with the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport to present this Learning Lab summer series focused on supporting museums in the Ministry's standards for community museums in Ontario. So at the OMA, we've been working with the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport to provide resources relating to the standards at our website. And you can get to the CMOG Standards Resources page from our homepage at museumsontario.com. If you haven't checked back lately, the recordings and slide decks from all of our previous webinars in this series are now available there. So if you missed any of those or if you want to revisit them, please feel free. We're particularly pleased that this continued partnership with the Ministry allows us to present this summer series on collections, conservation, education and interpretation, exhibition, and physical plant standards. So the OMAs plan these webinars with subject matter experts to provide information on best practice, but also to provide a venue for you to connect with your museum and heritage advisors from the Ministry. So if you have any questions specific to the standards themselves, you can get help with that. I see somebody in the text chat is saying they're getting an echo. Just want to make sure that you're not signed in twice by accident, which sometimes happens. I think you are, Shelley. So if you have two windows open, close one of them and you should be good from there. So this is the second webinar in our summer series, but we have several more in the works for the rest of the summer. So if you go to our website, the homepage at museumsontario.com, you should be able to sign up for those online as well. So we're very happy to have more than 50 people registered for today from all over Ontario, so thank you all for coming out. And I just want to make sure that everybody, if there's any new people, that you all know how to participate. So first of all, you should know that the slides from this webinar are going to be available on the CMOG Standards Resources page of the OMA website, along with the recording of this webinar, so you don't need to worry about writing down everything on the screen. You can just sit back and relax and enjoy. So you will be able to see the slides and you'll hear the presenter speak. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, you can just type your message into the chat box at the bottom of your screen and click send. If you don't want everybody to see your question, you can send it privately to just the presenters by using the Send To drop-down menu and selecting All Presenters. So I'm going to be monitoring the chat and we'll do our best to ensure that all of your questions are answered. But just do keep in mind that we only have an hour today. So if there's anything we don't get to in this webinar, please identify it in your evaluation. So as you can see in the agenda after this introduction, I'm going to pass the mic over to Fiona Graham, who's our presenter today. So please feel free to ask any questions about the content of the webinar during her presentation. After Fiona's finished presenting, there will be an opportunity to ask some questions to Elke Weinstein from the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport. So if you have any questions specific to the conservation standards and what needs to be reported on for that, please wait until Elke's section of the webinar. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Fiona Graham is a conservator specializing in preventive conservation. She has a master's degree in art conservation and artifacts from Queen's University and is accredited by the Canadian Association of Professional Conservators and the Canadian Association of Professional Heritage Consultants. She's worked at a number of museums in Canada, as well as the Canadian Conservation Institute and the Centre de Conservation du Québec. She worked for the Department of Canadian Heritage as a collections preservation advisor, helping museums obtain MAP grants and MCP designation. And at the Ministry of Culture here in Ontario, she was the conservation advisor and then the museum advisor for Eastern and Northeastern Ontario. So during that time, she managed the 2000 revision of the standards for community museums in Ontario. And Fiona has also been the course director for the OMA's Care of Collections course since 1999 and teaches the conservation course as part of Athabasca University's Heritage Resource Management program. She's currently an associate with Goldsmith Borgal Company Ltd architects based in Toronto, where she is involved in museum and heritage preservation projects. So Fiona has a lot of experience and knowledge to share with us today, so I'm going to let her take it from here.
Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me. This is my first webinar, so let's have some fun, and hopefully I won't say too often and drive you all crazy. Okay, let's go to the next slide. What am I going to be talking about? Brief introduction about what I hope to achieve in the webinar. Then talk about preventive conservation as a concept. Going to focus on temperature and relative humidity, light, storage, treatment, training, and then some final questions at the end. You'll notice that I have picked up on a lot of the questions that you submitted with your applications, and hopefully I'll get to a fair number of them. Some of them either because they don't quite fit into what we're covering because they're too sophisticated, or just require too much time to deal with. If I don't answer them to your satisfaction, please make a note in the evaluation and we'll get back to you on that. Okay. So the purpose of this webinar, and this is really important to bring up right at the very beginning, it is a refresher. It's not a survey. It's not an introductory course. I'm not going to be covering the basic concepts. I'm going to be pinpointing some of the common misunderstandings or gaps in knowledge that we noticed when we were reviewing the questionnaire, the responses to the standards questionnaire. So it is very specific to the CMOG program and the standards, and it is fairly specific to Ontario's community museums. So in other words, it's kind of pitched midway between really basic and really sophisticated, and so hopefully that'll help explain why maybe some of your questions are not being addressed in the way that you might have expected. So yes, we will be looking at issues that popped up in the questionnaires for the conservation standard, and to a certain extent physical plant standard and collections questionnaires. Conservation is embedded in all sorts of those standards. If you look carefully, you'll see it in exhibitions, you'll see it in human resources. It's kind of everywhere. So the webinar is really not meant to be a substitute for a proper training, such as the excellent OMA courses. Of course, I have no ulterior motive in saying that, or a forum for more advanced conservation questions. In some cases, in response to your questions, we'll be referring you to other resources that will do a much better job of answering than we can do in this forum. Disaster planning is going to be covered by Bill Nesbitt in his webinar, so you won't see anything about that in here today. And climate control is going to be covered in a lot more depth in my next webinar, because it's just such a big issue, and we could spend hours, let alone a whole hour on that. So if you have particular concerns about climate control, temperature and relative humidity issues, please sign up if you have not already done so for the next webinar. Okay, first things first, preventive conservation. The conservation standard talks about conservation in museums, and this includes preventive conservation as well as treatment. So preventive conservation is what we do to stop artifacts from falling apart in the first place, so we don't have to do conservation treatment. It's not only ethical, but it's also very efficient and cost effective. So it really does take priority in museums and galleries now. And this is, I underline this point because we have seen from time to time museums saying, well, we don't do conservation, we don't have a conservator, we don't have the training. But preventive conservation can be done by anybody within the museum who has the knowledge, and it's just a matter of often making the right decisions when doing the things you usually do. In fact, it's integrated into all aspects of museum work. So in response to the question, what can we do without a conservator, you can do pretty much everything that you need to do except for treatments beyond those that are covered in I'll get to that a bit later, but beyond basic treatments. So please don't think of conservation as something that only conservators do. It's something that museums do because it does involve primarily preventive conservation. And the other thing is that it's good to remember that you can use a multi-level approach to get around obstacles. If you, for instance, have an issue about being maybe in a rented facility, and so you can't control the environment at the building level the way you want to, you might be able to satisfy your professional needs as a museum and the standards at the same time by tackling that issue at a different level. And let me just show you my, I'll get to that in a second. My slides, I should know which order they're in. Basically, this is preventive conservation. It's not rocket science for the most part. So you can do this. And I apologize for the ancient slides, but these kind of say it all. This is collection storage before preventive conservation project and after. Okay, and here's my multi-level approach. And this is something when you're talking to your museum advisors about any difficulties you may be having in achieving some of the requirements and the standards. You might be able to work at a different level. For example, as I said, if you have problems at the building level, because you don't have as much control as you would like, then perhaps there's something you can do at the room level or the level of the fitting, which could be a display case or a storage cabinet, or even at the level of an enclosure, such as a box or a frame or an envelope, something like that. So when you're looking at each issue in the conservation standard, when you start to think about it, you'll find that you can address many of the things that you need to do at one or more of these levels. And of course, policies and procedures is sort of the overlying approach to getting things done when, in addition to dealing with things in a more tangible way. So yeah, I like to use the example of a museum that's in a building that's where they're just renting space, or they're sharing a building and they don't have control necessarily over temperature, for example, or relative humidity for the building, but they may be able to get permission to do things to improve conditions at the room level. And if not, they can do a lot with creating conditions within display cases or within storage boxes, for example, to protect objects that may not be doing so well under the conditions that are being supplied by the building manager. Okay. Very, very quick review for those of you who are new to preventive conservation. This is where we tend to start with our training. all of the things that pose a threat to the well-being of artifacts and collections as a whole. We've divided them up into 10 basic areas. Physical forces, that would be things like something falling on the ground would be a physical force. Thieves and vandals, pretty obvious. Dissociation is a complicated one that has to do with losing stuff within your collection or losing the information that goes with your artifact, and thereby losing a lot of the value of the artifact. We won't be getting into that today. Fire is pretty obvious. Water is pretty obvious. Pests, pollutants, light, and incorrect temperature and incorrect relative humidity is where we always seem to end up. For a really good overview of how these different risks affect collection materials, how to control them, and guidelines for things like levels of light and temperature and humidity, etc., you really should go to the Canadian Conservation Institute website, which I've labeled there. Unfortunately, the information that you're looking for is kind of buried. So once you get to that website, you'll want to go to the Caring for Collections link, and then from there to the 10 agents of deterioration, and then you'll see that they're basically chapters in a book at that point, and they're the most recent up-to-date information you will be able to find, and extremely helpful. Okay, so I will start talking about temperature. This is where we see a lot of confusion, and it's perfectly understandable because it is confusing. There's a lot of different information out there, and I'm here to tell you that what you're seeing right now is the latest and most accurate that we can possibly give you at this point. So, inappropriate temperature, what does that mean? Obviously temperature, we're not going to say temperature is a problem because there's always temperature. The problem arises when there's the wrong temperature for what your collections need. And it generally falls into 3 different areas. Oh, wait a second. Yeah, oh no, that's correct, sorry. I was getting ahead of myself. It's either too high, it's too hot, in which case the rate of chemical deterioration of your artifacts is going to increase greatly. In fact, there's actually a rule of thumb that for each 5-degree increase in temperature, you have the lifetime of whatever it is you're dealing with, whether it's paper or textiles or photographs, for example. So we'll talk about that a little bit further in the next slide. Obviously, too high a temperature will soften glues and waxes and things like that. It will deform plastics. So this is especially an issue for things like records and various magnetic media, audio tapes, that kind of thing. So temperature, usually when the most common temperature problem is temperature being too high. For example, in an attic, for certain things are able to withstand high temperatures and others aren't. Too low is actually seldom a problem. There's certain things that you don't want to freeze, and there's a list there on your screen, but for the most part, and this is the good news, cold is not only okay, cold is actually good. The lower the temperature, the lower the rate of chemical deterioration. So for those of you with seasonal museums, as long as you can deal with the potential for damp conditions, which would not be good. The temperature itself is not a problem. In fact, it's a good thing. You're giving your collections a break. So there's just a few things you don't want to freeze. Most paintings and fossils and rocks are not a good idea to freeze. So if you have those in an unheated building, you might want to take those out and put them somewhere else for the winter. Fluctuating temperature. We often see people saying, "Oh, we have to have constant temperature. It's bad to have it's bad to have fluctuating temperature." Actually, the effect of fluctuating temperature on the condition of collections is teeny tiny. The reason that people want to keep temperature stable is actually because it often helps keep the relative humidity from fluctuating. It's the relative humidity fluctuations, which we'll get to in a minute, that are the problem, not the temperature. It's a little bit of a semantic argument, but technically this is what's happening, and it's good to know to not fixate so much on fluctuating temperatures. So what's a good temperature? This is what you really want to know. Human comfort levels are appropriate for most materials, and since that's what you're liable to be getting, this is good news. The collections that should preferably stored at temperatures lower than human comfort levels, and notice I say stored, not displayed, because display conditions tend to be more temporary and for a smaller number of items in your collection than the things in storage. Storage is where, if you can do it, if you can get lower temperatures for these particular collections, you should do it. Electronic media, color photographic prints, most plastics, including rubber and polyurethane foam, acidic paper, acetate and nitrate film. Basically, if you have an archival collection, you would be doing it a big favor if you could keep it stored at a lower temperature. So that's the trick with temperature. The next, no questions yet on that. You're all just stunned. Okay, next issue, and obviously directly related, is inappropriate relative humidity. There is so much confusion about this, and like I said, it's completely understandable. It is very confusing, at least for some of us. Maybe some of you have a better handle on it than I do. Before I get on to relative humidity, I have a question regarding color negatives, if they should be at a lower temperature too. Yes, ideally they should be. I selected prints because they have they're in the extremely highly sensitive to temperature category, as opposed to the negatives, which are just in the highly sensitive. Yes, and yeah, lots of questions about this. Film at a lower temperature too. If you want specific recommendations for temperature and relative humidity for different collections, you can either come back to the climate control workshop or webinar, or you can check out the CCI website. It's very specific on this. So inappropriate relative humidity, like temperature, relative humidity is not in itself a problem. It's when it's not the right one for what you've got in your collection. And the main thing that most of us need to try to control is to avoid damp conditions. So when the relative humidity is too high, it's not good for most of our collections. You get mold, metal corrosion, buckling veneers, negatives and prints that'll start sticking together. And generally we're talking 75% humidity and up. Some conservators prefer to see that at 65% because of their own personal experience. So you will see variations in that. I'm giving you the CCI recommendation here, but certainly if your items are dusty or dirty, they will be more prone to have problems at high relative humidities, and so therefore at 65% with dirty collections you may actually start to have problems. But if your collection is in really reasonably good shape in terms of cleanliness, then a 75% is usually the cutoff. Other types of inappropriate relative humidity, there are special cases, certain types of collections and artifacts that need very specific types of relative humidity beyond the avoid damp consideration. Archaeological metals, because they're often contaminated with salts. Sometimes they may need relative humidity as low as 20% in order to keep corrosion at bay. Unstable glass, meaning glass that is the chemical composition is not quite right, and it tends to crizzle, which are those tiny little cracks in the glass. It may even tend to weep, where you actually can see little beads of water on the glass. That is one of those collections. For one reason or another, you need a very mid-range relative humidity that's quite stable. And most museums, if they have these types of materials, they will deal with that using enclosures that have that have relative humidity control within them through silica gel or similar. And certain minerals, if you have mineralogical specimens in your collection, some of those do need specific relative humidity. Okay, why is dust and dirt combined with higher RH a bigger problem? Excellent question. It is because the dust and dirt tends to hold water. It's one of those technical terms I try and avoid. It absorbs water and will hold it against moisture and will hold it against the surface. That's why a dirty surface will be more likely to grow mold more quickly than a clean surface. And that's why you will find mold growing on inorganic objects such as marble statuary or metals, where you go, wait a second, wow, why is there mold growing on stone? Well, it's because there's dirt on the stone. Okay, then the other aspect of relative humidity that gets a lot of attention is this business about fluctuating relative humidity. And you will see this when presented with a range of relative humidity that you are trying to achieve, for example, a 40 to 60% range, then you will see a plus or minus a certain percent afterwards, and that refers to the fluctuations that are allowed around those that range, and they can be short-term or they can be seasonal fluctuations. So if you change your level from a winter low of 35 or 40% to a high of 55 or 60% in the summer, then that is essentially a fluctuation. But mostly what we're thinking about is the shorter term ones, where the relative humidity on a day, within one day or within 1 week or within 1 month, will go up and down. And the reason we concern ourselves with this is because certain types of museum materials absorb and give off water, and depending on the rate at which they're doing that, it can cause damage. there has been a lot of research in recent years about what levels of fluctuating relative humidity are dangerous or safe, the converse, for collections. And the details of the current research, I would refer you once again to the chapter on relative humidity on the Canadian Conservation Institute website. But right now, I can tell you that, for the purposes of meeting standards, that a fluctuation of plus or minus 10 for most of you is going to be perfectly acceptable. And for many of you, a fluctuation of plus or minus 20 may also be acceptable. It depends on the nature of your collection and its history, whether it's been in the same building under the same conditions for many years. So basically, try not to get too fixated on if you see a requirement for plus or minus 5% or something like that, which is very tight and requires a fairly sophisticated air handling equipment. For most community museums in Ontario, you don't need to get to that level of control. So. And with regard to the standards, if you are reading the conservation standard, you will notice that you get to a certain point and there is a footnote which actually refers you to the end. Let me get this out here. And it actually, in the standards, it actually says an acceptable range is normally 40 to 60%. This condition applies to all buildings physically capable of maintaining these standards and to all additions to existing buildings or sites. Some buildings, because of structural or historical considerations, may require that this range be adjusted. Such adjustments must be based on individual assessments carried out in consultation with ministry technical staff. Now, this was written when there was a ministry conservation advisor. Now poor Elka and Kathy have to cope with this. But basically, there's your answer to what the standards are being very reasonable, asking you for a mid-range. They don't specify a fluctuation, so beyond obviously the 40 to 60, which would be, you could consider 50% plus or minus 10, but there may be some negotiating possible there based on your collection, because what the ministry wants is for you to have what's best for your collection, not to adhere to some kind of rigid guideline that is not appropriate for you. She says, speaking as a former museum advisor. Sorry, Elka. Okay. Moving right along. Another issue that often comes up in this is it's just the difference between monitoring versus controlling. Just be careful with your language for your own sakes and when you're talking to other people. Monitoring means you're measuring and recording, as opposed to controlling, which means what you're actually adjusting the heat or the light or the whatever. And monitoring is so important. You can't assume that you have a problem or that you don't have a problem with your conditions. And often it's the former. People will assume that they have horrible conditions. But we're not, as human beings, we're really good at assessing temperature, whether it's too cold or too warm. We're really bad at assessing relative humidity. We're not built for that unless it's super, super, super dry in the winter and our lips are cracking, or it's super, super, super humid in the summer and we're sweating, basically. But all of the fine details of relative humidity in the normal range, we really have to monitor. And you can't know whether you have a problem, and therefore you can't know whether you have to do something about it until you monitor. And the other thing I just wanted to mention is monitoring I'm think you all do know this, but it includes recording, not just measuring. And some of the instruments we use to monitor automatically record for us, such as the hygrothermograph, or thermohygrograph if you prefer. That's the picture in the middle. But if you have a basic hygrometer, which is something that looks like the one on the left of your screen, that you obviously have to make notes of the data yourself. Also, I should warn you that those are really not very reliable. The quality control varies tremendously, so I'm not saying get rid of them, but what I would do is borrow a more reliable monitoring instrument and check to see that your hygrometers are giving you a reading that's relatively accurate. And if you can upgrade to a more reliable monitoring instrument, I do recommend it. The hygrothermographs are now they're all, I wouldn't say they're dinosaurs. They're excellent machines, but they're very expensive. A lot of places that need multiple readings in multiple rooms are now going for data loggers, which is the image you see on your right. And those loggers, you do have to download the information on using a computer program that comes with it in order to see what you've got. But they're handy and they're relatively cheap. Excellent question just came up. Is too low a relative humidity a significant problem? Actually, no. This goes against a lot of our instincts from what we learned a long time ago. But if unless you have a brand new fashioned work of art out of fresh wood that's never gone through a season of changes, or you have freshly restored something, whether a painting or a piece of furniture, and got rid of all of the cracks, then basically your whatever you have is liable to have already undergone whatever changes it's going to make in response to low relative humidity. Low relative humidity actually is a good thing in terms of slowing down a lot of types of chemical deterioration, because often water is involved in running the chemical changes that take place. So the less water that there is in the air, the better. However, it's a tricky one, and often what we find when we get into really low relative humidity is that it becomes more of an issue of fluctuation. If the humidity is really low and then you get a large influx of people into a room, for example, you may have a fluctuation which may or may not cause problems. But this is one of those ones where conservators who've been around for a while do have trouble actually saying no, it's not a problem. But technically, for most of your collections, museum collections I'm talking, not fine art collections, it's not a problem. The damp is the more serious problem, and then after damp is the fluctuations, the really big ones, and then after that, well, if you have any collections that have very specific relative humidity needs, then those are the things you need to look at. But yeah, it's actually it's not nearly as big a deal as we used to think it was. Okay, so yeah, important to monitor and identify the causes of high or low or inappropriate temperature, relative humidity, light, whatever it happens to be, before trying to control it. So after you've monitored, you do need to identify the causes. For example, the example I always use, and I apologize for anybody who's taken care of collections with me before, is if you have a wet basement, are you just going to put a dehumidifier in it? Or are you going to try and figure out where the problem's actually coming from? Are you going to find that you need to fix your foundation, or to put down a vapor barrier on your basement floor, that kind of thing? So this all is part of this issue of understanding the difference between monitoring and controlling, and the importance of monitoring before you try and start controlling or changing your controls. Okay, this is a whole bunch of confusion that I'm just put all on one slide. What does heat do versus light versus relative humidity? Heat causes embrittlement or weakening of paper, textiles, and leather, and similar materials due to increased rate of fiber breakage. So you've all seen newspapers that get really, really brittle. Well, let's just say that will happen regardless of what temperature it is, but the hotter it gets, the faster it'll happen. So heat is a direct cause of that. It's unrelated to relative humidity or light. Warping of plastics, heat does cause that, and heat will cause yellowing of some things. But what heat does not cause is fading. Light causes fading. Heat does not cause fading. And heat does not cause warping of wood. That's caused by fluctuating relative humidity. Heat does not cause cracks. That's caused by fluctuating relative humidity. So yes, it's true that if you heat the air, the relative humidity will change, in other words, fluctuate, but it's not the heat in and of itself. The humidity has to go up and down for cracks to form. So just a matter of clearing that up. And in the same way, fluctuating relative humidity, I see this all the time. It does not cause corrosion. High relative humidity causes corrosion. Mold is caused by high relative humidity, not fluctuating relative humidity. And it's just when you're talking to facility managers or mechanical engineers, if you have to get involved with that, you need to make sure that you're using the right terminology. So and get it straight in your own mind as to what the actual problem is, and what the end result could be. It really muddies the waters if we're not clear. Hold on, I'm just trying to figure out how to look at a message that is long. Here we go, I figured it out. Yay! We have a very good question. There is a type of man-made plastic circa 1930 to 40 that was a common substance used in the creation of dresser sets that deteriorates and gives off an odor that calls your attention to the storage unit. Yes, probably a vinegar odor. Have you had to deal with this substance? I cannot remember the name, but I wish to add it to my list of never accepting, meaning accepting into the collection, presumably. Conservators I spoke to said to avoid accepting articles made of this material. Well, I would have a slightly different take on that. I would say, sorry, my computer just went blank, but no, it's back again. I would say, yeah, I mean, accept it, but just know what it is. And this is the kind of thing that we'll probably need to have a special enclosure made for it. What you're talking about, I believe, it's either cellulose nitrate or cellulose acetate, which were both early plastics, and they do deteriorate. They'll do it on their own. There's nothing you can do except you can slow down the deterioration by keeping them cool. and by not enclosing them in an airtight container. Now, the problem here is that because they produce kind of noxious vapors. I won't go into it in more detail than that when they deteriorate. And if it's cellulose acetate, you can smell it because it smells like acetic acid, which is vinegar. And it's called vinegar syndrome especially when you're dealing with negatives that are made of this material, and it will harm other items in your collection. I wouldn't say to deaccession or to dispose of them because of that. There are ways to deal with it. You can, for example, put these into special containers and put them in a freezer. Put them in a frost-free freezer, and there you go. You've slowed down the deterioration, and you've kept them away from the other items in your collection that may not appreciate being exposed to the noxious vapors. So there are ways of dealing with that, and I would say, yeah, it's a question of knowing what you've got, and there are ways to test and to identify those materials. Okay, moving right along, because as usual I get distracted and I talk too much. Okay, the effects of light versus ultraviolet. I just wanted to let you know that light damage what light damage look like. Fading is due to exposure to light, meaning when I say light I mean visible light. It also darkens some pigments, but if you have something that's faded, that's light, visible light that's done that. It's not ultraviolet. Ultraviolet damage looks like yellowing, powdering or chalking, and embrittlement and weakening of the artifact, of the material. So the reason I bring this up is that, before I get that, how do you measure light and UV levels? You need to either buy or borrow some monitoring equipment, and at least measure levels when you're setting up new displays so that you can adjust the lighting or artifact position as necessary. And also, you might want to check and see if any UV filters you have are still working. So measure them to make sure. They don't last forever. And we can't tell you exactly how long they last because it completely depends on how much UV they've been absorbing over the years. So the UV on one set of windows maybe will deteriorate a lot faster than the ones on another set of windows. Okay. This whole business about controlling light, we really need to control visible light as well as ultraviolet. People have become kind of obsessed about eliminating ultraviolet and thinking that that is all they need to do. Yeah, eliminating ultraviolet is simple and it should be done, but it's not enough. Light damage from the visible light accounts for at least 50% of the damage you get. And a lot more in most cases, and it's cumulative and it's irreversible, just like the UV damage. So you also need to know light damage is a function of exposure time as well as light levels. So if you have done your due diligence and got all of your light sensitive stuff at 50 lux, you should know that 2 years at 50 lux really is the same as 6 months at 200 lux. So in essence, controlling exposure time can allow you more flexibility in light levels. So that's something that's good to know for things that people are having trouble seeing and you'd like to be able to put in a brighter light. As long as you reduce the exposure time, you can manage your to expose the you're going to get the deterioration is going to be at the same rate, or no, I shouldn't say that. Deterioration is going to be the same amount. So for extremely light sensitive items, it's really important to control both exposure time and light intensity. So basically, if you have something at 50 lux, it's not going to prevent damage. It's just going to have it at a lower. It's just going to take longer to get there. And something that's got really highly light sensitive colorants in it is still going to fade within a few decades, even at 50 lux. So you really do have to start thinking about controlling the exposure time as well as the light intensity. So there's that simple 50 lux, 150 lux, 300 lux rule that's in the standards. It's simple, it's basic, it's easy to understand, but it's not. If you want to go one step further in not only protecting your collections but improving access, improving visibility, I would highly recommend that you start thinking about a lighting policy that will incorporate both exposure times and light levels. And there's lots of information about that I can provide you in a follow-up. Okay. Basic misunderstanding: storage. Don't try to achieve low light levels in storage. It doesn't matter unless the lights are on all the time, which they shouldn't be according to the standards. It's much better to have really good lighting in there for better visibility during inspections and cleaning than it is to worry about controlling light levels. You don't need to worry about that. Get rid of the UV if you want to, but this is a non-issue. Display, you might want to consider alternatives to traditional incandescent fluorescent lamps, such as some LEDs and fiber optics, if you're interested. Yes, LED lights are a very good option. There are ones available that have very good color rendering index now, but they tend to be fairly pricey. But they can be fit right into halogen fixtures and track lighting fixtures, which is really nice. So I will provide resource information for LEDs in another forum through the OMA. Oh, this is a biggie. Flash photography does not cause light damage to museum artifacts unless you have the Mona Lisa or the equivalent photographed 10,000 times per day, every day. It's tiny. The effect is tiny, tiny, tiny. The ban on flash photography has a lot more to do with, in the old days, with museums trying to make money by selling the images and the copyrighted images than it has to do with conservation. But conservation is always conveniently blamed because people will believe it. Oh, we can't do that, it'll fade it. Well, it's not true. Ta-da! Okay. Storage questions. Storage solutions that maximize space. In the standards, you'll see it says to store like with like, and that's a good reason for it's efficient as well as good for helping you find things when you're looking for them. So books with books, furniture with furniture, textiles with textiles, that kind of thing. Putting pallets on wheels for big stuff that doesn't fit on shelves. If it has to sit on the floor, put it on a pallet and then put the pallet on wheels so you can move it around. That is one of my big tips for maximizing space. And if you've got a big storage project, you really need to cram more stuff into the space you have, then that's where you look at compact or mobile storage. My favorite top two cheap tricks for storage are to put dust covers over the shelving units and to put padding on the shelves. Those will go a long way towards making your storage nicer for your artifacts. And then when we get the question about cotton versus plastic dust covers, it's pretty straightforward. Just look at your situation in storage and say, okay, if I've got lights on all the time when I don't want them to, I'm going to use cotton because it protects against light as well as dust. If I have the risk of water leaks, I'm going to use plastic because it protects from water as well as dust. And if you have light and water and dust, you can use dark plastic, or you can put the cotton over the plastic, or other way around. So There's lots of, it's just common sense, really. Another thing that comes up a lot that people don't realize, acid-free materials do not stay acid-free forever. They are absorbing the acids in the atmosphere and from the artifacts that they're surrounding. So unfortunately, you may have to reinvest in acid-free tissue every once in a while, so just get a pH pen from one of the museum suppliers, and very quick and easy will tell you whether your acid-free tissue is still acid-free. Prioritizing objects for treatment. This is something that you're asked to do through the standards in a way. So basically, I would say anything, any object where significant damage is imminent if nothing is done. That's a very good way of putting it if you're trying to explain to yourself and to other people how you would decide when something needs treatment. Anything wet or moldy or pest infested, obviously, and anything with powdery orange rust that's accumulating rapidly under iron artifacts. That's a good clue that you should probably get something done sooner rather than later. So that's, as I said, I'm really glossing over these, but these are just these are in part to answer questions and just pinpoint some of the areas where people were having trouble answering the questions in the questionnaires. Treatment questions. Somebody asked about, well, quite a few of you asked about treatments for metals, textiles, paper, that kind of thing. Honestly, my best advice is to consult the CCI notes for basic information. These are available for free on the Canadian Conservation Institute website. There are a huge number, and if they don't answer your question, then you can always actually contact CCI directly for specific advice. I hate to constantly be pointing you in that direction, but that's their job. That's what they're there for. So take advantage. When to call a conservator? My advice is basically, if there's anything that comes up that's beyond what the CCI notes covers, then you definitely need to call a conservator. If it's not in the CCI notes, it means that it's probably something that a non-conservator would not be comfortable doing. So that's my. It's not a comprehensive answer, but it's a pretty good one. And I would personally say, anything to do with paintings or photographs, call a conservator. There are just so many things that can go wrong with those things. I as an artifacts conservator, they scare me sometimes. So I highly recommend that you talk to a conservator about that. How to find a conservator? Haha. There is an organization called the Canadian Association of Professional Conservators who have a website. Not all conservators are members. There are a lot of good conservators out there who are not members. So if you do not find somebody that is local and available and convenient on that website, I would either call your nearest large museum or gallery and find out if they can recommend somebody, or you can go to our other conservation association, which is a non-accrediting organization called the Canadian Association for Conservation, and I've given you the website there, and just look for people in your area with specialties that match what you need done. It's not everybody in that. Anybody can be a member of that organization, but most people are pretty ethical and will tell you if they can handle whatever it is you want them to do. And if they can't, then they can refer you to somebody else. This is very, very picky little thing. A lot of people are still using clear nail polish for labeling. Just for your own sakes, it's going to peel off eventually. It's not a very stable plastic, so I recommend that you buy Acryloid B72, which is used the same as you would use nail polish, and you can get it from Carr McLean. It's called Liquid Label. It comes in clear and white. Just buy the clear one and then use white ink instead of black ink to write the numbers on dark objects. Okay. I have been extended. That's because I've got some good slides for you. Okay, another thing that came up fairly often is some people are still using pesticides in their museums, and I'm not quite sure why. They're not really required for the most part. They're integrated pest management techniques that are used for prevention, and then freezing, heating, or anoxic techniques, and that means basically eliminating oxygen using carbon dioxide or some other gas for treatment. So it may be that municipalities are still using them just as a matter of course, but it would probably be worth your while to find out why and if it's absolutely necessary for your health and safety. If nothing else, it's we're not in the tropics. It's not usually something that we have to do on a regular basis in Ontario museums. Okay, these are some fun pictures I grabbed off a couple of blogs just to show you, if you've never seen what insect residue looks like. The frass is what we call, basically that's what happens after the bug eats your artifact and poops it out the other end. It looks like that. And then those are cast skins of domestic beetles, so and you've got a good idea of how big they are relative to that pencil. And those are casings from case-making moths, which are one of the other main museum pests. So I just thought I'd throw these in for something for you to look at. These are some guys at a museum preparing to freeze artifacts as a means of getting rid of the pests that are on them. And I thought this was really cool. This is an American conservator who posted these two photographs showing a dime with, on the left hand side, those are the museum pests, typical ones. I won't tell you what they all are, just to give you an idea how big they are. And then on the right, that's the same dime but surrounded by what, from a collections point of view, are harmless pests. You notice how much bigger they are? The ones we have to worry about are small. Isn't that always the way? So anyway, I thought that was cool. Operating artifacts, as this issue has come up a few times. It's a collections management issue as well as conservation issue. I just recommend that people have a policy so that they know how to choose what artifacts to operate. You can classify them as part of an education collection, for example, or an operating collection or interpretive collection, whatever you want to call it. And it'll have different standards of care, including the level of restoration. And the other main thing, of course, with operating artifacts is health and safety issues. So if you are doing this at your museum, I would recommend that you sit down and write a policy to help guide you and your staff and volunteers and what you're going to operate and how. It can help explain to people who may question your professionalism either one way or the other. You should be operating this or you shouldn't be operating it. If you have a policy, a good policy, you can point to that and say, listen, we know what we're doing. Okay. Inspections. Please do your own inspections. Don't just rely on a municipal health and safety inspection. It's not sufficient. They're not looking for issues that affect collections. A lot of people think it covers them, but for the sake of your collection, for example, is the health and safety inspection going to catch either of these? That's a pest infestation on the left, believe it or not. If I get too close, you can't see what it is, and if I'm too far away, you can't see what it is. Anyway, that's and then this is a faded artifact that basically has nothing left on it, and it's in an exhibition and in a display. And obviously, this is not a health and safety issue, but it is a museum issue. It's a conservation issue. Conservation training. I cannot recommend highly enough the OMA's courses. If you have not taken them and you are freaking out because of all the stuff I've just thrown at you, please, you'll learn so much, and it's such a good grounding. The Canadian Conservation Institute also has workshops from time to time on specific topics. There's an organization called Museum Classes Online that runs museum classes online, including a lot of conservation ones. I'm currently developing a couple of new ones for them. And also, what a lot of people forget, you can request a workshop from Conservator on a specific topic, and what I often recommend is for museum networks to share the training and the cost. So I've done that. When I was at the ministry, I did that a lot, and I've done it as a private conservator too. I presented workshops on housekeeping and care of metals and various other things. And obviously those are the academic programs on the right, which you can refer to later. The final questions. These were two of my favorite questions from the ones that were submitted. What are the 3 most important conservation issues for small museums to focus on? Well, the proper answer is every museum will have different priorities, but in my personal opinion, if you can keep the water out, keep the pests out, and reduce light damage, that's really good. But I have to add the 4th, which is train your staff. That's the really, really, really important one. Not in you don't have to train them how to do conservation treatments, just a general conservation awareness raising about what the issues are with regard to handling, for example. It goes a long way. And then the other question is, what is the best way for a small museum to create a standard for everyone to follow? Written policies and procedures. There's a reason those are in all those standards. It's just because it's the first thing. It's what everybody falls back on. It creates a standard for everybody to follow. And training. And I think that's it. Yay. Sorry, I went a bit over.
Hi again, everyone. It's Mary again, and I see there is another question coming in right now, but we're just going to pass it over to Elke Weinstein for a moment. If you have any questions specific to the conservation standard or what you need to submit for that in the coming months, this is your opportunity. So I am just going to Elka's going to put on her headset and I'm going to pass it over to her for a couple minutes, and then if we have any time after Elka is done, we can have a couple more questions with Fiona.
Hi everybody. I hope everyone can hear me. I just wanted to thank Fiona for that excellent presentation. She has covered all of the topics that we were hoping that she would cover, including training, and I want to emphasize the training part because when we were looking at the answers to the standards questionnaires that we got in, we did notice that a lot of people either had kind of let training go by the way in some ways for their staff, or they were just relying on people to have kind of an innate sense or something. So I want to just kind of repeat that and say, if you don't have training, if your staff don't have training, I highly recommend that you have a workshop, that you send someone on your staff and to come back and give your other staff some training, and I think that's a really great idea. Fiona wanted me to talk about government programs that will help you with conservation projects and various things. There aren't actually that many, unfortunately. The only one that I know of that specifically targets things like collection storage is the Museum's Assistance Program, which has one intake a year, and we We know that their deadline is usually in November. This year they have a $1 million grant envelope, and that's for 2014-15. So if you need to rearrange your collection storage, if you need money for collection storage, if you need money for conservation projects, you can apply to the Museums Assistance Program, and that's a federal government program. It's Canadian Heritage, and you can go on their website to find out about it. Ontario Trillium Foundation sometimes has, they do community projects, and sometimes they will fund projects that will help you to reorganize your collections and things like that. And treatments. Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they have funded treatments.
Oh, okay. Very infrequently, this is the other thing, the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund will sometimes fund projects like that too, and that's another federal government. Obviously, Trillium Foundation is provincial. Otherwise, just be sensible about your collections. What the stuff that you can do, as Fiona's shown you in this this short seminar, is common sense. There's a lot of stuff you can do to take care of your collection that you will already know about and will be doing year after year to preserve and keep your collection in good shape. And and we're happy to give you advice if you want to call us, or you want us to refer you to someone. We're happy to do that. So just give us a call. Okay. All right.
I'm just going to ask Fiona to come back on for a moment, and if there's any further questions from her presentation, feel free to ask.
Hi, I'm back. This is just such a strange experience. Okay, we have some people talking about data loggers. Personally, I have experience with the hobo data loggers that Mindy has mentioned. Reed, I'm not sure, but I'm sure they're fine. It's just a matter of looking for what you need and getting a good price. The hobos are quite reliable. Don't go for the absolute cheapest one because it's not got a terribly good. It's not terribly accurate at the really low and really high range of relative humidity. But the other thing with data loggers is some of them have readouts and some of them don't. If you want a readout, it's more expensive, but some people like to be able to check and see what the temperature or humidity is just by looking at it, as opposed to having to download the or upload the information to a computer and then look at it there. So, anything else? I know, they're in shock, the poor dears. Yeah, go to CCI. I have a conservation resources list that I keep fairly up to date that I'm going to share with the OMA and see if they want to put it up on their website, which has a list of places you can go for information from organizations to websites, and the wonders of the internet are such that there's so much information available online now. The tricky thing for you guys is to know which ones to rely on in terms of the quality of the advice. But basically, I can say if it's on a hobbyist's page, if it's a jewelry maker or a car restorer, I would put a question mark after it, whereas if it's from an organization like the Getty Conservation Institute or the National Museums Association or something like that, chances are it's probably pretty reliable. So there you go.
All right, well, it's Mary again, and I just want to say a big thank you to Fiona Graham for her presentation. I think we have a lot to to go back and take a fresh look at our collections, I think, after today, and think maybe we're not doing so bad after all. And also a big thank you to the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport and to Elke Weinstein for the support of this webinar and to the Ministry staff's active participation every time we hold one. And thank you to everyone who signed in today for your participation. As I mentioned at the beginning, the slides and the recording of this webinar are going to be posted on the CMOG Standards Resources page of the OMA website at museumsontario.com. So that should be probably by later today, and I'll be sending out a link to the webinar evaluation later today as well. But there are more webinars coming up. Next week, in fact, Fiona will be back to talk a bit more about climate control, about actually, once you've monitored, trying to control what's going on in the environment. Then we have 2 with Chris Castle on outcomes-based planning and evaluation, one for programs and one for exhibits. And then in emergency and disaster plans and maintenance manuals with Bill Nesbitt in August. So those registrations are open for those now, and you can go to our website and sign up for them, and it's all free as usual. So please do check those out, and once again, thanks for coming. And if anybody else wants to sign up for our artifacts course, which Fiona mentioned, registration for that is actually open right now. We still have space. It's going to be in beautiful Thunder Bay at the end of August, so keep that in mind, and I hope we'll see you there. Thanks, and have a great day.